Welcome back, everyone, to the Moms Like Me podcast powered by Support Now. I am so excited to be back. I actually was on vacation for the last few days, of spring break with my kiddos in Charleston, South Carolina. So I'm back in the seat talking to adults, which I'm really excited about. It's been a long few days, a happy few days, but long nonetheless. But our guest today is someone who I've been anxious to interview for the last couple of weeks as I got to understand a little bit more about her story. I've met our wonderful guest through Support Now. She has a registry. And at the exact same time, as I was learning more about her motherhood journey, I thought, wow, she would be a perfect guest to offer a really unique perspective on her journey on the podcast. So, Sharon Ciummo, welcome to Moms Like Me. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So, Sharon, as I've shared with you prior to hitting record and in our previous conversation, one of the things I'm always looking for are really just kind of different takes and perspectives. And so many of the families that we support now, tend to be kind of what I would consider earlier in the journey, whether that be a diagnosis, a disability, or just even a major event. And something that I found really compelling about where you are is that your son's 21. And with that comes a lot of knowledge and a lot of perspective. And so I'm really excited to have you share a little bit more about your son, Marco. It sounds bizarre to say, let's start at the beginning, but I kind of do want to start at the beginning because I know about his story. I know,
Mhm.
obviously but if you don't mind, talk to me and talk to our listeners a little bit about what kind of catapulted you into this Down syndrome world, really from the very beginning.
Sure. Marco was born in June of 2024. We did not know prenatally that he had a diagnosis of Down syndrome. When he was handed to me after he was born, I looked at him and looked at the nurse and asked if he had Down syndrome. And they said no, that they didn't think he did, but I thought I saw some visual telltale signs that he did. So they took him off to the nursery. And then a little bit later in the night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, they came in and told my husband and I that my suspicions were likely correct, that they hadn't done any testing yet, but he did have some markers for Down syndrome. So we knew within about 8 hours after he was born that Marco had Down syndrome.
And Sharon, so just to go back, so in utero, so you did not know anything in utero,
Correct.
or did you forego those tests? And what were those decision points like for you and your husband?
The only thing that I had that was a little different was the level 2 ultrasound because I was considered an older mom at that age. I would have going to be 35 when I had Marco, so I did
Oh, the
have a level 2
geriatrics.
ultrasound.
Yes.
But they did not detect anything. So there were no things. They didn't detect the hole in his heart. They didn't detect any of like the nuchal fold or anything like that. So it was definitely a surprise. But when I reflect back on it, I'm sort of glad that I didn't know prenatally because I think that being the person that I am and knowing my personality, I would have been preoccupied with trying to understand and know everything and really not would have enjoyed my pregnancy and what I was looking forward to when he was born.
Yeah. So you were able to enjoy your pregnancy without the worries and the concerns and just honestly just remain pretty present.
Correct, exactly, exactly.
So, Sharon, when you ultimately get the diagnosis, you're still in the hospital. What are some of the first few thoughts that come through your mind, if you remember?
Well, my best friend from growing up, her firstborn son was also diagnosed with Down syndrome. So I was like, oh, Christy and I have done things together all our lives, and here we are doing one more thing together. So I knew about Down syndrome already because of being around Zach, but also just because of my degree in education. I had a little bit more of a background of special needs. But sure, obviously, parenting a child with Down syndrome was going to be completely different and something that I had no idea how to do, but my husband that night in the hospital came over to the bedside and told me that he thinks that his brother, who had passed away, who is actually Marco's namesake, had sent us Marco and wanted to put Marco in the hands of people who were going to love him and guide him and do all of the things that they knew he would need Marco.
And how hard was it for you to balance, again, the acceptance of him with also the grief that comes with knowing that you're not going to have that kind of like typical parenting journey of a typical child?
I came to acceptance rather quickly, simply, I think, because of the way I was brought up and that everybody is valued in the eyes of God. So I came to that acceptance very quickly. However, the grief really never goes away. there's stages throughout Marco's life, just last year when he turned 21. I didn't have to worry about him going out and getting wasted and possibly come to alcohol poisoning. We were happy that he took a couple of sips of his rum and coke on his birthday when we went together as a family. So all of those milestone things that come along are definitely still a time of grief for me, but I notice that I don't dwell in it as long as I once did. I'm able to just step back much more quickly and look at who he is and what he has brought to his life, our life, and everybody he's ever met, and I'm able to get through those waves of grief much more quickly.
And Sharon, you've mentioned to me before that the first years were difficult for you,
Mhm.
but not necessarily for him.
Correct. So I always was wanting to find like the perfect gift for Marco, or the things that I thought when he would open up the gifts, he'd be like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was waiting for. So for probably 4 or 5 years on Christmas morning, I would be so excited because I thought I found the perfect gift for him. Well, Marco did enjoy opening up the gifts, but he could not have cared less what was in them. So there was a lot of tears on Christmas mornings, on birthdays, any types of things where I was gifting him something that I thought was going to be the gift that he connected with. And so it took me a while to realize that to connect with Marco was to give him the gifts that I knew he already enjoyed. So we started giving him an overabundance of koosh balls, an overabundance of sensory toys. Eventually, it got to the point where we were giving him boxes of Lucky Charms and Nutri-Grain bars on Christmas and his birthday and other holidays where you receive gifts. And that is when I began to see Marco light up when he would open those gifts, because I had stopped following my heart and wanting to find that perfect gift so I could see the response I was seeking, and then just gave him what he really wanted and really liked.
I feel like that is so much easier said than done, right?
Oh, yes.
I hear this all the time. It's not about what you as a mom or a parent wants, but it's about what your kids want and finding joy and what lights them up. What were some of the strategies or what were some of the things that you did to kind of get through those, I mean, difficult grief moments, honestly, where
Mm,
you realize, okay, this isn't exactly what I expected. Even I love the example of Christmas because I think it's one of those milestone moments, as you talked about before, where you have this expectation of what this should feel like and how he should feel. And when that's flipped or it doesn't go as you expect, as a mom myself, like those things can crush you. I mean, they can
mhm.
really just completely ruin the day. So, what did you do in those moments? How did you get past it? Did you do that alone or did you have a group of people that you consulted? What were your methods of breaking through those difficult times?
I have always had an incredible support system in my family. I have 4 siblings. My mom and dad were still around at the time. They're no longer with us, excuse me, but my husband was pretty good. My husband is, as you know from asking the origin of my last name, a full-blooded Italian, and so sometimes emotion and things are hard for him to come by, but through our journey, we've learned to talk through that and kind of grieve things together. But it was just a lot of, it was a lot of tears. It was a lot of talking to my siblings, particularly my sisters, my mom at the time, and really trying to help me just through that moment of intense sadness. But what really pulled me out of it was looking at Marco and realize that he wasn't sad when he opened the gifts that I thought were amazing. He just went through the motions and was like, "Oh, this is nice," put it aside. But that moment when I realized giving him the box of Lucky Charms or the 500th koosh ball, he was happy. And so it was learning really to use Marco as my guide to help make decisions for what I was going to do with him. And later, when he was old enough to play sports, the same type of thing happened. We have all of these wonderful organizations and the Miracle Leagues and top soccer and Special Olympics that I was so excited because, I was an athlete growing up. My daughter's an athlete. And I was so excited to get Marco engaged in those. And Marco, again, could not have cared less. Marco liked to go and he liked to just watch from the sidelines, and he loved the movement of everybody running or the ball dribbling on the court. And initially that was difficult for me because I felt bad for the volunteers, because here's Marco coming to this, top soccer, and all of these young kids are coming to volunteer their time and he won't get up off the field. And so I felt sad and frustrated for them, and so that took me a while, and so We stopped doing any of that for a while. And then just last summer, I'm like, he's older. There's a lot of growth. We're going to try it again. So we went and tried to do Miracle League Baseball. It was the same thing. He swung the bat one time, he ran down to the base, and that was it. And he sat down and just wanted to watch the action. So I was like, okay, we tried it again. It's not for him. And I know I take him when his sister is playing softball because he likes to watch the action. So again, just really trying to figure out and use him as my guide. That doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt and doesn't make me sad sometimes that he doesn't get to the level that I would love to see him get to, or that I know he could do at a different level of involvement, but he's doing it where he wants to do it. And that's what's important.
Well, and I think this is a really interesting spot. I wanna pause here for a second. What percentage of this is the Down syndrome versus just, like, his personality and who he is? And, not all kids like sports, not all kids like certain activities
Rest.
that and that can be very challenging for parents that have an expectation, or I'm also a sports person, and it's been very interesting to see my kids try to take to certain things and they don't, and that can be very hard.
Yeah.
So how do you analyze kind of like what are the physical medical ailments versus like just who
Who
Marco
he
actually is?
Yeah, and Marco actually has a diagnosis of as autism as well, so that makes it even a little more complex to determine
Sure.
where his lack of desire for, lack of a better word, might be coming from. But I
Yeah.
truly do think the more that I get to know Marco and have learned of him through the years is that a lot of it is just his personality. He's very chill, he's very content, and even the fact that he's nonverbal due mostly to his apraxia
Mhm.
diagnosis, there has never been frustration on his part for the lack of being able to communicate because he does communicate. He communicates on a basic level. He's able to let us know what he needs and what he wants. And so I think it is really just Marco's personality. He's very content. He doesn't have to be active. He doesn't have to be on the go. Whereas my daughter is the opposite. Ava needs to be fill her clock. She needs to be going, 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 going. And I do think, yes, obviously the Down syndrome and the autism play a part in it, but I do think it's more greatly related to his personality and who he is.
Right. The diagnoses that he has is only amplifying the person that he already is
Mm,
inside versus
correct.
being like dictating exactly who he is because
Yes.
of right. So, Sharon, one of the things that I often hear from medical mamas is how overwhelming it can be at the very beginning and really throughout about all the options and requirements of what you're supposed to do now. So you have this Down syndrome diagnosis. In this case, you also have an autism diagnosis. He's nonverbal. And there are just a million things that doctors, and now social media influencers, providers are all saying that you need to do in order to provide the best life for your kid. How did you navigate those decision points along the way, knowing that it never ends, right? It's kind of bottomless in terms of what you can continue to provide for your child. How did you and your husband navigate those different opportunities for him?
I think it comes back a lot to Marco's personality there again. In the beginning, I was doing everything. I was researching, I was fine. I had the in home services. I had people coming to my house 2 to 4 times a week for OT, PT, speech therapy. We took them to outpatient therapies. We were doing it all. And what I was noticing was number one, it was like a time suck on our part because we needed to figure out where we were fitting all of these into our schedule. And then more importantly, I noticed that, yes, while Marco was engaged while these people were here, he didn't necessarily carry that over into his day to day life, right? So if he was successfully building blocks with his occupational therapist, when I would pull the blocks out, he wasn't doing it. He didn't have an interest in it. So it was as though he was almost doing it just because he kinda knew he had to do it to get through this particular time in his day, but it wasn't bringing anything to him that he wanted to necessarily, like, continue, like, "Oh my gosh, all of a sudden I have this love for blocks." And we tried for years to get him to be, like, engaged with cars or blocks or, Play-Doh, painting, anything, and he would do everything Marco does is very short-lived. Like, if we get 5 minutes out of an activity with him, we're thrilled, and that has been his MO. So, again, just really taking Marco as his guide. Like, putting aside what I want in my heart or my husband wants in his heart and just letting Marco be Marco. And some of the best advice I got when I had Marco in the hospital, they were wonderful with his diagnosis. And, there was a time there was an anesthesiologist who had just had a set of twins, and one of them had Down syndrome. And he came to speak to me. And the doctor, before we left the hospital, said to me, "Go home and enjoy your son. Learn about your son. Don't learn about your son with Down syndrome." And that was probably a thing that I held in the back of my mind. Didn't probably tap into it as early as I should have, as to letting Marco kind of find his path and me follow him on that path. But I did eventually get there. And when I got there, I realized that I should have been doing it all along. But it takes time for your heart to get there.
Yeah, and by the way, that's beautiful advice. It's, like, so succinct.
Mm,
And I think that's, just a wonderful reminder that labels often, like, pull you in directions that are unnecessary and complicate it,
yeah.
and when you really get down to it, we're all just people, and we're all wired differently, and
Mhm.
I think that's really beautiful advice. I also just thinking here, Sharon, about what also makes your situation a little unique is your special needs education background. So not only do you have the quote comparison of, maybe even your daughter to your son or to, typical versus atypical children, you also know other special needs children. So that adds like another layer of complexity for you because to your point, it's taken you a while to know that Marco just may be a chill kid, but you also see examples of kids perhaps with Down syndrome, perhaps with autism, perhaps with both that
Yeah.
might be achieving or excelling in certain areas that you
Yeah.
don't see. And so that just kind of adds to this. I would imagine there's been certain times where it's just perplexing to you.
Yeah, it's
So,
definitely
how
been a blessing and a curse for sure. Because you think you're in this community of people with Down syndrome, and you're like, "Oh, great, you find all of these people." But what I then found was there obviously, even though it doesn't state that there's different levels of Down syndrome as there are of autism, there are different levels, right? And whether that comes from the genetics of the development of the Down syndrome or it's because of the personality of the child, I don't know and probably never will know. But, there are people who are much more profound with Down syndrome than Marco. And then there are people who are lapping him. And when those laps started happening early on, it was very, very difficult for me because, here Marco was 5, and the other 5-year-old on the forum that I found was, reading, and Marco was not anywhere near that. That being said, Marco could read sight words, he can blend words, he can do all of that. He has no desire to. So again, just going back to that thing I always seem to keep circling back to is just figuring out who he is as Marco, not as his diagnosis of Down syndrome or Down's apraxia or autism.
yeah,
So, and it was difficult at first too for me to find the correct support within the community because when, this was kind of pre-Facebook, but I was finding forums, and the forums were either, "Woe is me, I have this child who will never achieve anything," or "My child's going to be the first president of the United States with Down syndrome." And I didn't feel either of those ways, and so I just kind of felt middle ground, and so it took me a while to find people who were in that same line of thought as, "We're going to do what we need to do, but not overdo for him or us."
right. And to your point, using him as your guide. If he
Correct.
is accepting of a certain therapy or an activity, a certain trip or a location that like makes him happy and you can see ignites him, great. But if it doesn't, not forcing it because Marco sounds like a really incredible person as just a reminder of what
Mhm.
life can be, right? Life doesn't have to be about excelling. Life doesn't have to be about, all the superfluous things that we do. It can
Yeah.
just be being content and happy just with living.
Yeah, and to also keep in mind that the placements and the decisions you make for your child are also, again, needing to be based in what's going to make them progress and make them the happiest. So initially, we had Marco. in a fully inclusive pre-K program. Shortly after that, we knew it wasn't quite right. He had a one-on-one, although he didn't have an aide. Initially, I actually had to fight for the aide. He was at the time 3 years old, nonverbal, non-ambulatory, and still not potty trained. And they were going to just have him in a typical pre-K classroom. And I'm like, okay, he's knee high to a grasshopper. If, God forbid, there be a fire in the building and Marco's sitting on the opposite side of a shelf playing with a toy or looking at a book and a fire alarm rings and they go, Marco's not going to yell, "Hey, I'm here." He's not going to have the wherewithal to know that he has to get up and go, nor could he at the time because he still wasn't really walking. And so from the beginning, I knew it was going to be a fight to get everything that Marco needed. And so my life has been a battle against insurance, everything. But you do what you have to do and you have to educate yourself because nobody's really going to tell you what's available there, especially if it's going to cost somebody money. But then after that, we moved into a more supportive classroom and he was in like an autism support classroom. And eventually, where he still remains now until June 5th, he is in a fully inclusive setting. And when Marco moved to that fully inclusive setting 14 years ago is when we just saw him really begin to blossom because he was in a place where he felt comfortable. He felt that he could trust. He felt that he could grow, and he did. And in fact, when I dropped him off one day a couple weeks ago at school, I was lamenting with one of the gentlemen who receives the students. And I said, I am in just such denial that this time in Marco's life is over. He's like, yeah, we were just talking the other day. We need to see if we can get Marco on the payroll to stand out here and greet everybody in the mornings and give high fives because they love him too. Because they let Marco be Marco, and Marco is comfortable being who he is there. And the other places he wasn't because he was overwhelmed. It was too much for him. So the right decision for your child is the right decision to make.
So Sharon, what does the future look like for him? Obviously you talked about him aging out of the program that he's in, which sounds like it's been wonderful
Mhm.
for him and for you and your husband, I'd imagine.
Yes.
What do you anticipate in the next, few months and years? What are your like goals? Like how do you look at things moving forward?
So I have everything in place. I am definitely a planner and it helps to be a planner. He's going to squeak one more summer out of this amazing summer camp called Campaign, which is a camp that's run by the YMCA here in Pittsburgh. And he's been there for, I think he started when it was 5. So this is going to be his 17th summer. And so we were able to squeak one more year out because he turns 22 after it starts. So we met that 21-year-old deadline. So he'll do that in the summer. I did do a lot of visits to programs and things in the area, and sadly, I wasn't finding anything that I was comfortable. One of the things that about where Marco's been, whether it was Camp AIM in the summer or Pittsburgh Public Schools for the last 19 years, I felt comfortable where he was, and I never gave Marco a second thought. If I were to put him into any of these programs that I was visiting, I wouldn't have that. I would be preoccupied with whether his knees were being tended to, whether or not he was getting what he needed. Fortunately, I'm in a position where I'm able to have 2 amazing people come and be his full-time hab aides, and they will be the ones who are, taking him out into the community daily. My friend's son, Zach, who I mentioned previously, he is a little 5 years older than Marco, so he's involved in, like, a daily group where they go out and they bowl some days, they play deck hockey some days, so Marco will be engaged in that. There's an incredible organization called Always Be Smiling here in Pittsburgh that was developed a few years ago that offer amazing programs as well, so we'll probably have Marco in programming. We couldn't find a day program that I was comfortable with, and
Yeah.
so definitely another piece of advice is follow your gut and follow your intuition. If you're feeling something's off, something probably is.
Yeah. And I'm also learning from you that it seems like you've been pretty good about making decisions one step at a time, not trying to get ahead of yourself. What are we going to do in a few years? Or what are we going to do once he turns this age? It seems to me that you and your husband have done as good a job as any as trying to just stay focused on like, what's the decision that we have to make today? How can
Mhm.
we solve for this today? How can we make sure that he's in the best environment possible? And then we'll get to the next decision when we get there because things are so fluid. And it seems like There's so many new resources coming online constantly that
Mhm.
if you spend all your time thinking about or projecting ahead too much, like you wouldn't have any time for yourself. Is that
And
correct?
yeah, 100%, but it took me a while to get there. Like, in the early years of Marco, who's gonna take care of him when I die? When Tony and I are gone, who's going to take care of him? And I spent years probably bordering on some depression, worrying about those things. And what clicked or what switched, I'm not sure, but luckily I was able to get to a point to just, focus on the here and now and the very near future as opposed to the very distant future. That's not to say, again, that it's not frustrating. Just when you think you have something figured out, you get an email the next day that this needs done in addition. Or so it is a constant, constant, constant
Yeah.
work. When you get into the waiver world, it's different from when you were in the Medicaid world and how things were paid for then and what waiver is. It's very different.
Yeah.
And one huge piece of advice is to even though I just said don't look too far ahead, you do have to look somewhat ahead as far as those types of logistics.
Great. Great.
Really educate yourself on the waivers in the area where you live. Waivers usually kick in when children are 18 and they're covered by Medicaid up until that point where they can get their caregivers and things. So know what your child is eligible for as far as caregiving, that type of stuff through their insurance, and then familiarize yourself with the waivers because I'm not even sure if they're the same everywhere, but Pennsylvania has the 3 levels of waivers. Marco's currently on the middle waiver. So, really making yourself knowledgeable there, but getting somebody in your pocket who is even more knowledgeable. I have a guy who was one of Marco's very first, supports coordinators who was promoted shortly after he started with us, who I have in my pocket, and I know I can reach out to Derek anytime. And so, yes, educating yourself, but you still are not going to know everything. So, really finding that key person in whatever organization it is that you trust and is knowledgeable and you can lean on when you're feeling a little overwhelmed because it's going to happen more than you want it to.
Yeah. Sharon, I'm so grateful for your time this morning. It's been insightful for me, and I think there's a lot of layers of advice here for any parent, to be honest.
True.
Motherhood and parenting it's a long journey. I think people and moms especially, we often second guess our instincts, and there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of comparison, and I think that, as I said mentioned earlier, Marco is such a good reminder that sometimes it doesn't need to be as complicated as we make it, and
Right.
sometimes like the beauty in life is just being here.
Mhm.
And so I'm super grateful for frankly your honesty and transparency. I really resonate frankly as kind of that mighty middle where you find yourselves and because parenting can be polarizing and people like to find their
100%.
camps and that can be very challenging, especially in the medical world. And so I think that there's a lot of people that will resonate with this that just need to hear that it's okay to not feel so strongly in one direction or the other and that your kid can just be your kid and that's good enough.
Yeah, and to feel strongly and believe in yourself enough to know that no matter what which side is saying, you probably are making 99.9% are making the right decision for your child.
Yeah, it's still ultimately that mom gut that pulls us through
Mhm.
every time, right?
Yep,
It's
absolutely.
tried and true,
Absolutely.
as non-scientific and yet so scientific considering they were attached to us in utero.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but thank you, Sharon, so much. As I
Thank you.
mentioned, we are going to be in the show notes with your permission. We'd love to share Marco's registry so people can understand a little bit more about the journey that he's on. But we are continuously grateful for moms like you telling your story because there's so much more than what meets the eye. Frankly, I'm excited to follow along his journey as well. So thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I enjoyed it very much.